Hi there, welcome back. It's me, Mr. Berg, and I'm back with another virtual video lesson. Of course, I'm your virtual video teacher, and today we're going to be talking about voting. I'll stop. You're probably wondering, Mr. Berg, why do you have a mask on? Well, the mask is here to symbolize this type of strange, weird year that we've had as a society. COVID-19 has changed a lot of things up. It's quarantined a lot of people, and that's not the only different or strange thing going on this year. This year we have an election year. What does that mean? Well, as a country, we have an election every 4 years, the last one being on 2016, where we vote for the President of the United States. In 2016, we elected Donald Trump, a Republican from New York, and he has served for the last 4 years now. As we enter this 2020 election, we have Donald Trump going up against Joe Biden, a Democratic candidate from Pennsylvania. And I get it, you're probably wondering, well, why is this so important? I'm 13, this shouldn't matter. Well, who we elect president is such an important deal because the president kind of becomes the figurehead of our country. He's the person we decide that will push us forward, that'll guide us forward for the next 4 years. Furthermore, to other countries around the world, our president a lot of times is the head person, the guy who's representing the country that stands for freedom and democracy. So there's a lot of weight behind being the president of the United States. So as we think about 2020, everything that's going on, modern day implications, who the people of the United States decide to vote for and elect as president is ultimately very important. And that's why I wanted to talk about voting today. So when you talk about voting, I think you, of course, have to talk about the history of voting rights in America. Now, I'm not going to sit here and just run down an entire timeline of voting rights. Instead, I'm going to sit here and go through an entire timeline of voting rights while implementing other videos so that you guys can see stuff told better than I could teach it. In 1788, our founding fathers of the United States would establish something that we call the Electoral College. In the Electoral College system, the American people do not directly elect the president or vice president of the country. Instead, the Electoral College electors elect who will be president based off of the votes of American people. And to give you a better understanding of the Electoral College, I'm going to play a video for you guys because I think it's very important that you watch it because there's so many people out there that have no clue how the Electoral College works, what it does, what the implications of it are. And it's not just students, it's many people my age and Mr. Robinson's age. So let's take a look.
Most people have heard of the Electoral College during presidential election years. But what exactly is the Electoral College? Simply said, it is a group of people appointed by each state who formally elect the president and vice president of the United States. To understand how this process began and how it continues today, we can look at the Constitution of the United States. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution. It specifies how many electors each state is entitled to have. Since 1964, there have been 538 electors in each presidential election. How do they decide on the number 538? Well, the number of electors is equal to the total voting membership of the United States Congress, 435 representatives plus 100 senators and 3 electors from the District of Columbia. Essentially, the Democratic candidate and Republican candidate are each trying to add up the electors in every state so that they surpass 270 electoral votes, or just over half of 538 votes, and win the presidency. So how do states even get electoral votes? Each state receives a particular number of electors based on population size. The census is conducted every 10 years, so every time the census happens, states might gain or lose a few electoral votes. Let's say you're a voter in California, a state with 55 electoral votes. If your candidate wins in California, they get all 55 of the state's electoral votes. If your candidate loses, they get none. This is why many presidential candidates want to win states like Texas, Florida, and New York. If you currently add up the electoral votes of those 3 states, you would have 96 electoral votes. Even if a candidate won North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and West Virginia, they would only gain 31 electoral votes total from those 8 states. Here's where it can get a little tricky. On a rare occasion, like in the year 2000, someone can win the popular vote but fail to gain 270 electoral votes. This means that the winner may have won and collected their electoral votes by small margins, winning just enough states with just enough electoral votes, but the losing candidate may have captured large voter margins in the remaining states. If this is the case, the very large margins secured by the losing candidate in the other states would add up to over 50% of the ballots cast nationally. Therefore, the losing candidate may have gained more than 50% of the ballots cast by voters, but failed to gain 270 of the electoral votes. Some critics of the Electoral College argue the system gives an unfair advantage to states with large numbers of electoral votes. Think of it this way. It is possible for a candidate to not get a single person's vote, not one vote, in 39 states or the District of Columbia, yet be elected president by winning the popular vote in just 11 of these 12 states: California, New York, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Georgia, or Virginia. This is why both parties pay attention to these states. However, others argue that the Electoral College protects small states such as Rhode Island, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and even geographically large states with small populations, like Alaska, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. That's because a candidate can't completely ignore small states, because in a close election, every electoral vote counts. There are certain states that have a long history of voting for a particular party. These are known as safe states. For the past 4 election cycles, in 1996, 2000, 2004, and 2008, Democrats could count on states like Oregon, Maryland, Michigan, and Massachusetts, whereas the Republicans could count on states like Mississippi, Alabama, Kansas, and Idaho. States that are teetering between parties are called swing states. In the past 4 election cycles, Ohio and Florida have been swing states, twice providing electoral votes for a Democratic candidate and twice providing electoral votes for a Republican candidate. Think about it. Do you live in a safe state? If so, is it a Democratic or Republican safe state? Do you live in a swing state? Are your neighboring states swing or safe? Is the population in your state increasing or decreasing? And do not forget, when you're watching the electoral returns on election night every 4 years and the big map of the United States is on the screen, know that the magic number is 270 and start adding.
So I think from that video you can see why the Electoral College is so confusing and why people are so up in the air about it, not knowing if we should keep it or if we should get rid of it. A lot of people don't like that the one candidate can win the popular vote but then lose the presidential election because they didn't get enough electoral votes. But again, the video does a great job of explaining why, allowing electoral votes can benefit some of the smaller states that we have in the country. But let's move along through the timeline. In 1820 and 1830, as states began to join the Union, they created their own state constitutions, outlining who was allowed to vote and who wasn't. Eligible voters at the time were mostly white male landowners. They had to own property, and that was considered a way so that those landowners couldn't lose their own land to voters who didn't own land, if that makes sense. They were worried that if they gave voting rights to everybody, voters would choose to take away their land from them. At the same time, there was a small number of few free black men who were allowed to vote, but there was no women at the time allowed to vote at all. And that's going to be a theme that you'll see as we work through this timeline together. 20 years later, in 1840, women began to organize and to petition for suffrage. Suffrage is a way to describe the right to vote. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Stanton are 2 of the most famous leaders of the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement would continue for a very long time, and we're going to continue to go through it in this timeline. Moving right along, we get to 1866. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution is passed by Congress. What it essentially states is that men who are 21 years old or older and are also residents of the United States have the right to vote. Any state that did not provide these rights would then lose electors in the Electoral College, and obviously this was a big deal because you wanted your state to have as many electors possible so that you could influence the vote as much as possible. Everybody wants to have that piece of the power, the piece of the pie, so that they can affect the election in their favor. However, it is important to note that women still did not have any right to vote. It wasn't really even being mentioned at the time. We jump 3 years later to 1866, and Congress passes the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. This amendment grants all men, important men, the right to vote, regardless of race, color, or if they were formerly slaves. Again, this amendment does not give the women in the country the right to vote. And I say that this was passed and you could vote regardless of race or color, but things would slowly creep in that would become obstacles and barriers for people who were still poor or people who were of color from keeping them out of voting. Smart people were coming up with ways to say, all right, well, we're going to make you do this if you want to vote. And for a lot of people who were poor or people of color, that meant that there was not a lot of chance for them to vote. But I'm going to play this video that I think describes it a little bit better for you guys.
5 years after the Civil War ended, the 15th Amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution. With it, African American men gained the right to vote. On March 31, 1870, a man named Thomas Mundy Peterson became the first black person to cast a vote in a local election in New Jersey. Unfortunately, states still found ways to limit African American men's right to vote through literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation tactics, and grandfather clauses. Grandfather clauses stated that African American men could only vote if their grandfather had voted. This limited the vote for many men who had enslaved ancestors. The clauses weren't declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court until 1915. Likewise, poll taxes and literacy tests in the South became voting barriers. In Mississippi, for example, voters were required to pay a special tax for 2 years before being allowed to cast a vote. If you couldn't afford to pay the poll tax, you couldn't vote. States also issued literacy tests filled with complicated questions designed to severely limit the African American vote.
Coming back in from the video, it's clear that you can see that people were creating barriers and obstacles for people who were poor or people of color so that they couldn't vote. It was unfair, it was unjust, but that's what was happening. And things like that wouldn't be addressed until we get into the 60s. But as I've laid out, women this entire time still were struggling to get the right to vote. The suffrage movement was alive and well, but they weren't gaining much traction. In 1878, an act to amend the Constitution and give women the right to vote is introduced into Congress, but people did not want to pass it, and they were coming up with so many different reasons why women shouldn't have the right to vote, and so it did not pass. We would go almost about 42 more years, until on August 18th, Congress passes the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which finally gave women the right to vote. So you look back all the way at 1788 to now 1920, you're talking a long time before women truly got the right to vote. People had pushed and pushed and pushed against women, and I say people, I mean men, had pushed against women getting the right to vote, and it took that long until 1920, 100 years ago, for women to get the right to vote. But I do want to keep going with the women's suffrage movement, and so I'm going to play a video for you guys so that you can understand it a little bit better than how I can describe it. So let's jump into that.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. No, that's not the Declaration of Independence. It's actually from the Declaration of Sentiments, a document signed at the first ever Women's Rights Convention in 1848. Back then, women in the U.S. weren't allowed to do a lot of things men were, like vote, and it would take them another 70 years to be granted that fundamental right. Why? Well, many thought encouraging women's involvement in politics would undermine society. The prospect of women voting was threatening to the white men who held power. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott decided to organize factions across the country that were campaigning for suffrage, or the right to vote. The convention at Seneca Falls, New York addressed women's rights and inspired other conventions and meetings. Stanton considered it the beginning of the women's rights movement. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was introduced, which would give black men, but not women of any color, the right to vote. Suffragists were split. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the amendment, objecting to the exclusion of women. They formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, hoping to pass a constitutional amendment that included women. Others, like abolitionists Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, supported the 15th Amendment. They founded the American Women's Suffrage Association and lobbied for the women's right to vote on a state level instead of through a national amendment. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Black men could vote, but women still couldn't. In 1878, a women's suffrage amendment penned by Susan B. Anthony was finally proposed in Congress, but it was defeated on the Senate floor in 1887. In 1890, the separate suffrage movements merged, opting to tackle suffrage by state in the wake of the federal amendment's defeat. Within 6 years, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho granted women the right to vote. Wyoming had already done it in 1869. Around the same time, the National Association of Colored Women was formed, bringing together more than 100 black women's clubs. It included leaders Mary Church Terrell, Josephine Silent Yates, and Anna Julia Cooper. By the turn of the 20th century, the women's suffrage movement had gained renewed momentum. Parades, marches, and pickets drew great attention to the cause. Between 1910 and 1918, a number of states and territories expanded voting rights to women. In 1912, 15,000 suffrage supporters took to the streets of New York City. But as women's political power grew, so did the danger they faced. In 1913, on the eve of President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, hundreds of women were injured in a massive suffrage parade in the nation's capital. In November of 1917, 33 suffragists were arrested outside the White House. The women were clubbed, beaten, and tortured by prison guards at the Occoquan workhouse. One of the movement's leaders, Alice Paul, founder of what became the National Woman's Party, was placed in solitary confinement in order to break her will and undermine her credibility. But press coverage of the women's treatment increased sympathy for their plight. And in 1918, Representative Jeanette Rankin, the first woman in Congress, opened congressional debate on a women's suffrage amendment. The resolution failed. In 1918, President Wilson also came out in favor of suffrage, declaring it was needed as a war measure. Wilson argued that women had been providing vital roles during World War I, and that their votes should be counted in order to make the world safe for democracy. Finally, in 1919, the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment, the same one written by Susan B. Anthony back in 1878, was passed by the House and the Senate. And on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially incorporated into the U.S. Constitution, prohibiting denying the vote to a U.S. citizen based on gender.
As I mentioned, it wasn't really until the 60s that people of color and poor lower class people really got the same rights to voting as everyone else was, the middle class and especially the upper class. So in 1964, on January 23rd, Congress passes the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, outlawing poll taxes, which were fees and just other taxes people had put on voting so that it was harder for people to get in. They had to pay certain taxes. And this was a tactic for the longest time that had discouraged poor people from voting. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act is signed in by President Lyndon Johnson. The act enforces the 15th Amendment that had been in place for a very long time, but it explicitly stated that obstacles such as literacy test or complicated ballot instructions were against federal law. So as we finally move through this timeline, we're going to take our final stop into the 70s. In 1971, on July 6th, the 26th Amendment is passed by Congress, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. You're probably wondering, well, why did this happen now? What was going on? Well, during this time, we were entering into the Vietnam War. There was a draft going on, and lots of 18-year-old young men were being drafted into the war. And people of the time thought it was unfair that you could be 18 and be drafted and told to go to war, but you were still too young to vote. You had to be 21 to vote. So they thought, if I'm old enough to go to war, I should be old enough to vote for who decides that I go to war. And that was a fair assumption. And so with the 26th Amendment, it then changed the age to 18. In 1975, Congress expands the Voting Rights Act to protect voting rights of those who did not speak English or read English at all. Just because you can't speak it or read it fluently doesn't mean that you're not a citizen. You have just the same amount of rights to go take the citizen test, and if you pass it, people didn't feel like it was right to hold voting away from you because you weren't fluent in our own native language. So we just worked through the whole timeline of the important stuff that's really gone on in regards to voting rights in America that I think you guys should know. There's a lot more that we could dive into, but that'll be addressed later in your academic career in more detail that I think will do justice for you then. But I do think it's important that you understand how to vote. I get it, you're 12 or 13, you've got about 5 or 6 years before you can vote, but a lot of people, again, don't understand how to vote in America or how to register to vote and do it correctly. So I want to run through how that happens. To vote in the United States, one must be a U.S. citizen and at least 18 years old on election day. States will also require various periods of residency before voting is permitted. Most states also have two other rules. A voter cannot be a felon, or a voter cannot be mentally incompetent. In all states, voting is free. It's also voluntary to vote. No one is going to force you to vote. At the same time, it is also a crime for someone to try to stop you from voting. It should also be noted that voting is private. No one's allowed to see who you're voting for or what you're voting for. It's your own opinion, and it's hidden and tallied in a private way. Each state, county, city, or ward is divided into voting districts called precincts. Before voting, people must register to vote in the precinct in which they are living. This consists of filling out a form with your name, address, and other information that they may require from you. Registration ultimately ensures that people are voting in the right place. If need be, and especially something that's become common this year, people can usually vote by mail in their state. On election day, most voters go to a polling place to cast their ballots. It's usually a public building, a church, a school, a firehouse, a city hall, a recreation center, something like that. Voters present themselves to the poll workers, provide identification, and then receive the material they need so that they can cast their vote. Elections may take place at many different times. A presidential election occurs every 4 years, but in the United States, general elections are held every 2 years in every even-numbered year. They are usually held on Tuesdays that falls between November 2nd and November 8th. People can also vote by mail, and that's becoming very common in 2020 with people not wanting to go outside with COVID-19 occurring. This is submitted through a form that we call an absentee ballot. Again, absentee ballots are very helpful for those who can't leave the house, who are not currently in their hometowns on election day, or those who don't feel safe going out. After all votes have been cast, poll workers and election officials count them and usually have help with some sort of computer software. At that point, they declare which candidate or ballot measure has then won. And when I say ballot measure, I mean votes on public issues. Think of like the levy that was passed that allowed Pleasant to build a new building. It's important to note in the United States, voter turnout, or the percentage of qualified voters who do vote, can depend on the type of election being held. Usually more people will come out to vote on a presidential election than they would do on a general election, and that's been the case for a very long time. For example, in the 2000 presidential election, only 51% of the qualified voters actually turned out to vote. We never get 100%, no matter how many people or influencers or ads you see telling you to vote. A lot of people just do not vote. And so that begs the question, why vote? And I get that. And, growing up, I wasn't entirely sure why it was important to vote. I didn't really know. And so what I want to do is give you my reasoning for why I think it's important to vote. And then I'm going to share some videos of people that I've asked that are in my personal life why they think it's important to vote. So why vote? Well, voting is important to me because it represents the ability to express my own beliefs and how I would like the country to be heading. When I vote for someone, it means that I am backing them in their beliefs and that they're going to vote for the things that I believe in or run the country the way that I would want the country to be run. Furthermore, I think voting is a way to express our own freedoms that is something that so many people in this world do not get the chance to do. So when I vote, I'm doing something that's special and important and can influence how my daily life is going to be for the next 4 years and how people's lives around the world may be affected for the next 4 years. So it's very important.
I think it's important to get out and vote because the president has such a big role in depending what goes on in the country. So I always get out and vote for who I think would do the best job at running the country and who has the same beliefs that I do.
Hi, my name is Hannah, and I vote because millions before me have risked their lives to ensure my voice is heard.
It's important to vote for the leadership of our country and the fact that a lot of people have given their lives for the privilege of us to be able to vote. That's why I think it's important to vote.
I just got done voting today. I think it's an important role as a citizen of the United States that we vote to express our opinion and to get the people in office that are going to express our opinions for us. So that's why I vote.
Voting is important because you have the power to decide the life you want for yourself and future generations. Voting is an opportunity to promote these changes within your community.